Pat Nevin's very much a friend of the show. He's got very good Chelsea connections. Pat, I'm sure today's judgment fascinated you as well. Good evening, Pat.
Good evening. Fascinated is a good word. Disconcerted is probably another word that I would use. I have to say, for someone who's worked in anti-racism for the best part of 32 years now, you would expect me to stand on one side of this, but I'm really feeling quite uncomfortable about it because obviously the law of the land is to create one thing, and the FA has gone down a route to say that John Terry has said these words. Now, he has clearly said those words, but it would appear that the intent hasn't been taken in consideration, or else they do not agree with what John Terry suggested, i.e. it was in a question. So it's one of those ones where, you know, if John Terry said what he's supposed to have said, but said it as an abusive tone as opposed to a questioning tone, well, I'd say throw the book at the guy. But it would appear that the courts have disagreed that that's the case. The courts feel that he was not guilty of that. So it's a strange situation for the.
I don't think they could. The courts couldn't prove it. They didn't say that he was repeating what Anton Ferdinand said. They just couldn't prove it. Yeah,
well, exactly. They couldn't prove it. So you're telling me that the Football Association have managed to prove it as well, inconclusively.
Well, so let me read you something.
It's so important going forward for a number of reasons. Number one, it's very important to John Terry. It's sustaining his character. That sustaining his character will always be there. But on the other side of it, those of us who have worked so hard all these years to make sure that we chase racism out of the game, there is a problem that there are people who are on the other side of the argument who say this is just scapegoating, and I don't want to give these people a voice.
Let me read you something from Paul Goulding QC. He was the chairman of the panel that sat for Luis Suarez, and this is what he's had to say. Well, this is what he explained in the piece by our chief football correspondent Martin Lipton. He wrote it down in the Mirror Football. It's an excellent piece, breaking it all down. And in the written reasons explaining the penalty imposed on Suarez, he said this: "It is not necessary for the FA to prove that Mr. Suarez intended his words or behaviour to be abusive or insulting. Our task is to decide whether, in our view, the words or behaviour were abusive or insulting." So effectively, he's saying we had to decide whether we found the words abusive or insulting. It had nothing to do with what the court may or may not found. And I think, Pat, I just wonder if there's a misconception that the FA were going over ground covered by the court when that wasn't the case.
Well, what is clear from what you say there is that the FA take no heed whatsoever of context. If it's in a question, or if it's, you know, if John Terry, for me, if John Terry's asking the question, as he claims, and it might not be right, he might be telling a lie, but as he claims, if he's asking the question, I don't think that's an abusive, that's abusive towards the player. Now, it may well be that that's the FA's rules. In fact, indeed it is the FA's rules. And from within their rules, they are right to ban John Terry and fine him, etc. But I have to warn people to be very, very careful, because I just caught the end of your last conversation there, and all the vile things that were said throughout that court case by both parties. And I can tell you, many parties have said many things to me in football pitches over the years. And is it only the case that racism is the only thing that leads to a ban, or is it suggestions of your sexuality? Is it suggestions of your intellect? You know, where do you draw the line on that? And that's where especially if you're not directly calling someone that, you're asking the question of whether they're calling you that. It's an extremely slippery slope that to go down. And I underline very clearly, if there was any intent whatsoever by John Terry, then throw the book up.
But it seems now that it will never be proved. The whole thing, the issue of he's been found, he wasn't charged in the court of law. He's now been banned for 4 games. It's still as thick as mud, isn't it? Nobody really knows what went on, and his character won't be slurred, I don't think, because nobody still knows. This hasn't proved anything. You're just saying there earlier on that you're still, you know, you're not sure whether to believe him or not to believe him. He said one thing, you know, we're not quite sure. So it's still, nobody will know whether it's been a racist comment or not.
Yeah, you cannot prove it entirely one way or the other. doing only one person's word against another person's word. You know, and it's one of those ones where he may well have said it and he may well be lying, but you've got to prove it. That's what our courts are there for. That's what our law is all about. This case is not... A lot of people think this case is about racism. At this point in time, it's not. It's about a point of law. It's about, in reality, getting to truth. And if you cannot get to certain truth, I think you're taking a massive risk with someone who, for the rest of his life, and you say his character isn't ruined by this. Well, I would say to an awful lot of people, it will be. And if you go and watch John Terry play a game of football, now he gets plenty of abuse when he plays football anyway, but this will follow for the rest of his career, and not just his football career, whatever career he does after this, be it management, be it whatever. This is a stain in his character that I suspect will never be removed. That's why I'm so concerned about it. I'm so serious about it, because, you know, I'm such a keen follower of getting rid of racism in football. I'll tell you what, I don't want in the crossfire someone who hasn't done something, who you think might have done something, to get caught in that crossfire. That's unfair.
I think the only difficult thing for him, Pat, is that he does admit saying the words, and according to FA rules, you know, if you say those words and, you know, you're on the field of play, you're caught on camera using those words, then you have a case to answer, and that's
do you think, out of interest, do you think if any player that you ever met was told, if you ask a question of someone using what is, you know, A, industrial language, and B, foul and abusive language, and C, racial language, but if you're asking a question, before this case, did any player think that they would have been in the wrong? I suspect most wouldn't have. Because, if I was putting in, plenty of things were said to me, plenty of things, and if I turned around and said, did you call me X, Y, and Z, am I then under suspicion? I'm not sure that would be directly fair. I can remember plenty of times being called gay by other footballers. It just so happens I'm straight. I'm not in any way homophobic, but I would have turned around and said, well, my wife might disagree with that. And
I don't think Anton Ferdinand would be called John Terry Black, would he?
Well, and the other thing, of course, just to add on to that is, and I've got to be brief about this because I've got to head to a break, and I'm always pleased to have you on, Pat, but I just think if I accuse Stewart of calling me, of using a racial slur against me, I don't think Stewart would repeat it. I think he'd drag Wayne in and say, did you hear me say anything racist to Darren? I don't think he would repeat.
And the fact that he tried to say he said something else. That was in the initial time.
You've hit the nail on the head there, Dan. I mean,
I would agree that there is no way in the world I would use the language in any way, at any time in my life, that John Terry has owned up to using. I wouldn't do it. But there are people who would, and there are probably quite a lot of people who would, maybe those who have no tertiary education, and it's an intellectual thing, and it's maybe a part of the life that they've grown in, that they fight fire, with the views that they think they're held. Now, it sounds as if I'm trying to get John Terry off here. Do please understand me, and I underline this. If John Terry did it, I have no sympathy, and I wouldn't care if he never kicked a football again in his life and never darkened the door of a football club again. I would be the first person hounding him out. It's just that there's no certainty in that, other than the fact that the words were said, but when they said in a deliberately racist way. You're absolutely right. You can go in circles. The words were said. If that's the FA's laws, I'm not convinced people knew that those were the FA's laws.
Pat, we're really pleased you could come on tonight. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Pat.
My pleasure.
Pat Nevin, the ex-Chelsea star.